Okay, so let's first talk about Elizabeth. Just have her first name. I could not find a picture of her, so just imagine your most famous Elizabeth in your mind. So if it's Queen Elizabeth, well, QE1 or QE2, I don't care. So Elizabeth was a really similar case to O, which we talked about in the previous part, okay? So here we have a lot of evidence for capacity. Okay. Now, Elizabeth has what many refer to as, scientists refer to as eidetic memory. How you refer to it, though, as photographic memory, right? Photographic. So I'm going to draw my camera, flash, and then a button. Choop. Wee. The camera just took a picture. I don't know what I'm doing. Awesome. So photographic memory, as if your memory was a snapshot. Okay. So she would do these kinds of dot patterns. Okay. And she could do a lot of them. So there's a famous case of a dot pattern of a zebra. So the dots formed a zebra, okay? 10,000 dots. 10,000 dots. So this is how she learned them, okay? Day 1. Learn the placement of 5,000 of those dots, okay? And this was randomly selected 5,000 dots. So you're already thinking to yourself, I know this. How do you randomly remember 5,000 dots? Okay. She didn't know it was a zebra. Day 2. Okay. Day 2. Remaining placement of 5,000 dots. Okay. Here's the wild thing. 5,000 by itself, no information about a zebra. But together, you can see the zebra. So, day 3, she would recount dot placement mentally. I'll put that in parentheses here, right? She wasn't actually like drawing it. Identified the zebra. That's wild. Wild. Like, but this wasn't necessarily pointillism that wasn't necessarily pointillism, actually. It was these kinds of dot patterns. So that's what I think what the wild thing is that it wasn't necessarily pointillism in that way, because maybe you can start seeing a pattern of a random half of the dots if it was a pointillistic picture, but these points were separated enough that couldn't identify either way with the first 5,000 or the second 5,000. Only when she was able to put them together in her mind after those 2 days was then the zebra an active feature of it. So it's hard to see how this would be no technique. I mean, you can try this. But you're going to be there for a while. You're going to be there for a long while. Okay. And I don't think it's going to be fun. So, just a brief interlude. What's the deal with eidetic memory then? So, eidetic memory is not actually photographs. Okay. So it's not actually like what it was. But it's close to it. But it's essentially what is happening is because perception and imagery are the exact same processes in reverse, and especially when you factor in the biological substrates of brain areas, they are the exact same processes in reverse. They're not actually photos, but it's more like perception formed a really good mental image, and that's what you're drawing on when you are bringing it back to mind. Okay. Eidetic memory is seen quite a bit, observed in children a lot. Children are pretty good at being able to reproduce these things. I don't think 5K or a 10,000 dot pattern that has some sort of meaningful image in it, they can do, but it's observed in children, and then it decreases with age. So by the time you're my age, your age, it's probably not a thing. It's probably not a thing. I used to be really good. I'm pretty sure I had an eidetic memory as a kid. And this may be the reason why you can't tell me things. I need to see them so I can visualize them. And that's what sticks in my memory. So, every time you ask me, hey, Dr. Swan, can I do this? Or, hey, Dr. Swan, I can't come to class next week or in 2 months from now. I'm going to be like, you got to tell me that because I'm not going to remember that. So email me so I can read it. It needs to be in words. Reading. Words. See. Not here. Now, my hearing is probably as messed up as possibly could be. I mean, I'm the millennials are the headphone leading generation with like it in your ear. So my hearing's probably going to be gone by the time, maybe I'm 60. So, yeah. And you all will probably have that same problem too, but I'm leading the charge here. So don't tell me things. You got to write them down for me. And then, I'll remember exactly everything about it. Exactly everything about it. Isn't that weird? I think that's weird. Okay. Let's talk about the last super memorists that I wanted to talk about. His name is Solomon Shereshevsky. S. I'm just going to refer to him as S. Now, Solomon here, that's Solomon. S. Okay. And the other guy that I had up here, and I'll go back and forth between them. This fine-looking dude is somebody with a great first name. Am I right? Luria. So this was the super memorist, and this was the psychologist. Well, I'll just call him the scientist who wrote about S. Okay. So we're going to talk about Solomon Shereshevsky here in detail. Okay, in detail. So far we have talked about a large group of a semi-small group of memorists who are mostly technique folks, right? So the O and Elizabeth seemingly were had impressive feats of memory because they could do things that don't really lend itself to techniques. So we could say that their capacity is pretty good, but everyone else we talked about is technique. Right? Like the runner from last part, 7 items to 80 items, but digits only. Bitter, who explained how he chunked out math problems and elaborated upon them. All right, Einaudi and Diamondi doing learning amazing memory things, and Einaudi doing it as an illiterate person, like wild stuff. So Luria found S. I think they were actually acquaintances of one another. And the idea behind Luria asking Shereshevsky something came from a meeting that they had. Luria spied one day S wasn't taking notes. Of a presentation. So we asked them, why don't you take any notes? And S responded, here's the entire lecture word for word. And then proceeded to give the entire lecture word for word. Isn't that wild? That's a really good. The veracity of the story is probably maybe suspect, but it's a good story and I like it, so I'm going to share it. Okay. Now I'm gonna make a claim about S. S could not forget anything. And I'm going to tell you why, with the salacious details coming afterward. Okay? The idea is that his capacity is unique, or was unique, I should say, but whatever. And B, techniques that he does use and identifies techniques were nothing seen before. So if we go back to those normal distributions, of capacity and technique, Luria is over here. Or excuse me, S is over here. High technique, high capacity. Okay. Which I think is pretty cool. One of the few. Okay. Another story regarding how these two men spoke to one another and how they got into a testing situation with one another was that Luria approached him in his 20s, and he was a newspaper reporter. Shereshevsky was a newspaper reporter and was sent to Luria by his editor because his editor had noticed his amazing ability on things that he remembered, like being able to recount stories and things like that. Just like I mentioned, right? So the first thing Luria did was have him do a digit span test. Okay. And in that test, it was clear that we have somebody very similar to the runner. 70 items, single presentation. Wow. 70 items. He could also do it in reverse order. So much better than Diamandi. Because Diamandi couldn't, he only remembered one order, one way. S could do it frontwards, backwards. Oh, it's wild. And he could pick any part of the list. So we're talking about, so these are black and white photos. So we're talking about the 20th century. So this is after Charcot and Binet and their stuff in the in Europe in the 19th century. We're talking about mid 20th century for these men. Okay, I'm just putting that out there. So what did he do next? Well, he decided, okay, well, let me give you a list. Digit span test. Now with a 3 to 4 second delay between digits. Because generally speaking, you just say one digit after the other when you do this. He was pretty good at it. He was still pretty good at it. But here's the wild thing. A week later, repeatedly, still perfect. Still perfect recall. Wild. This is like, the more you think about it, you're like, whoa, how could somebody really do this? So after these two kinds of tests, among other tests, Luria just gave up. He just gave up and he was like, okay, what is the nature of S's memory? What is the nature of S's memory? And so what he embarked on was a qualitative study. And that qualitative study included things like just asking him his techniques. How do you do the thing? Okay. And S replied, well, no mnemonics. Did I spell mnemonic wrong? Yes, I did. No mnemonics. No chunking. No elaboration. Here's the first inkling of what happened. He would say, I see them. This C is going to become very important in a moment. Okay. All right. So he's like, okay, well, if you see them, let's do some visual stuff. Okay. So because Binet and Charcot's stuff about Einaudi and Diamondi were published now, he was able to draw, Luria was able to draw on those. Okay. So Luria used previous methods. So these methods included things like the 7x7 matrix of items, right? 7x7. And he could do all of it. Diagonals, rows, columns, forwards, backwards, he could do all of it. So, support for some visual memory capacity, or I should say increased visual memory capacity. Okay. C, Luria used proactive interference and retroactive interference to see whether or not he could fumble him up. S wasn't affected. What? That's wild. Because their friendship / working relationship here lasted for so long, he remembered so many lists, and they were talking about 16 years later, and he would stare off into space and say something like, quote, yes, this was the series you gave me when we were sitting once in your apartment. You were wearing a gray suit and you were staring at me like this. Now, then I can remember you saying, and he trails off, end quote. And then he would reel off the list. What? Here's the salacious detail. Just kidding. I don't have that yet. Just trying to keep you on your toes here. Here's the salacious detail. He had somebody in his headphones, and they were writing it down, and they would just talk back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Walkie-talkies. It's the greatest trick somebody's ever pulled. Just kidding. That has nothing to do with it. They weren't as advanced as that. Okay. So what was it? What do we not know about S here? What do we not know about S? Somebody maybe take a guess with the whole not affected by proactive interference, retroactive interference. He could see things and he would be able to place somebody in the room with the digit list, among other lists. Anybody want to take a guess at what we're talking about here? Synesthesia. So Shereshevsky here had synesthesia. And so this is cross-modality perception. And in cross-modality perception. So in S's case, it was all senses had a visual component. It's very rare. But it does affect a small percentage of people. And it's essentially cross-wiring of sensations through perceptions. Okay, so cross-modality perception. So in, kind of like how people can see music and stuff. Exactly. And so the idea is that here's one thing that he would say. A well-known Russian psychologist, I can only assume that refers to Pavlov. His voice was yellow and crumbly. Okay. When he heard tones, he saw them as puffs of steam and splashes. And so a tone at 2000 hertz was fireworks with a pink-red hue. Okay, so 2000 hertz equaled pink-red hue. I'm just going to do this. Do I really want to find? That's what he saw when he heard a tone at 2000 hertz, right? And he said this about his synesthesia. He said this, quote, "I recognize a word not only by the image it evokes, but by the whole complex of feelings that image arouses. It's hard to express. It's not a matter of just vision or hearing, but some overall sense I get. Usually, I experience a word's taste and weight, and I don't have to make an effort to remember it. The word seems to recall itself, but it's difficult to describe. What I feel is something oily slipping through my hand, or I'm aware of a slight tickling in my left hand caused by a mass of tiny lightweight points. When that happens, I simply remember without having to make the attempt." Wait, hang on to your horses there, Hannah. Hang on to your horses, because it's not as great as it seems. If you ask somebody who has mild synesthesia, they might go, "Yeah, it's all right. I see time as spatial." But in S's case, not so much. Not so much. So, continuing with what Luria was doing, now that he recognized that this was synesthesia and that there was a cross-modality here of all of his different senses, incredibly overstimulating indeed. So everything S did, numbers, letters, voices, all had visual qualities so he could distinguish them. The word green produced the image of a green flower pot. The word red spontaneously produced an image of a man in a red shirt, which, for some of us, we can do this too, but he takes it to the extreme. Blue produced an image of someone waving a small blue flag. Okay. Even numbers spontaneously conjured up these images. So Number 1 is a proud, well-built man. Number 2 is a high-spirited woman. Number 3 is a gloomy person. And when asked why number 3 was a gloomy person, he would say, I don't know why. 6 is a man with a swelled foot, and so on and so on and so on. Right? So you just ask him, hey, man. Number 10. And then he would tell you what immediately comes to mind with absolutely no prompting. He wasn't consciously aware of it. So yeah, it's a pretty wild condition, and his seems to be quite a bit more tough to pin down. Memish, thanks for the follow. Where do his images originate? I would imagine they originate in the same areas as all your mental images originate. So the reverse of perception. So we're talking about frontal areas down into visual areas instead of the other way around. When you see something, visual areas to frontal areas is perception, and so his is going backwards. And it's just how the wires get crossed. Now, what's the salacious detail as we finish class? The salacious details that I left out. So Shereshevsky had a girlfriend who became his wife, and one story goes that she was being studied by him, even though he was the one who had the prowess, I'll say. And she seemingly had the abilities to do things like Elizabeth. But once Luria got his hands on her, so to speak, she couldn't really reproduce any of that stuff. Shereshevsky ended up marrying this woman. Not as salacious. It doesn't sound as salacious as I say it out loud. I'll be honest with you. So apologies if you are underwhelmed. He might check his boundaries, indeed. The last thing I'll leave you with, as everyone, very underwhelmed, as everyone is ending, S did have some issues. Came with a price. The price was he was quite incapable of using logic and abstract types of organizations. He would not, his ARC scores, his clustering scores would not, it would be close to 0. Okay. But here's the thing. If you asked him, hey, here's a list of birds, can you remember them? He would be like, yeah, I'll remember them. What was the list you just did? I don't know. He wouldn't realize that there were a list of birds, even though he was remembering, canary, crow, robin, or whatever. And then if I gave you the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 6, he would remember those. But then if you would ask him, okay, what's the pattern? Oops. What's the pattern? You all could recognize what that pattern is. He would be like, I don't know. Do you like my emote? I hope you do. If you coughed while he was talking or learning if you coughed while he was learning a list of words, that cough would become a cloud of smoke in his mind, and he would be prevented from learning that part of the sequence. I wonder if you asked him the word bird looked like, and then asked him if the list, what was described when he could say bird. Yeah, so I sort of get what you're saying. I sort of get what you're saying. Like, what does bird sound and look like to him? Yeah, if it's an actual bird. I don't think it would be, to be honest with you. So, S had real difficulty comprehending simple information, because everything made his mind go into overdrive, and that interferes with understanding. You know how when we're trying to learn, we try to, take the gist and sort of make it as small as possible? He couldn't do that, because anytime there was a noise, anytime there was some sort of interference of somebody else talking, he would have to go into that mode. And it was very overwhelming. Yeah, so any other sounds would impair his ability to do it. And so if you asked whether or not he had a full and rich and lovely life, he would probably say no. But he's dead now. I would say he would have said no.